Hi, this is the ninth video presentation for our English 3175 Studies in Genre Issues in Documentary class. And this one will be about the intersections of documentary, neorealism, and the Brazilian aesthetic of hunger. Last week we talked about ethnographic filmmaking, how American filmmakers and Western European film pioneers would photograph people from other continents and other countries, particularly people from Africa, in order to sort of capture the capital O other, in order to capture the rituals and the crafts of people that were different from them. I talked about how Felix Renault's 1895 film showing a Wolof woman manipulating an urn and creating an urn with a large rod was usually considered to be, or is usually considered to be, the first ethnographic film. What is involved in this, of course, is a kind of colonial gaze of exoticizing the other, and it very much is an extension of two kinds of phenomenons that existed in both American and European culture at the time. Fairs, such as world fairs or regional fairs, that would highlight indigenous arts and crafts, sometimes in less than flattering ways, and a freak show aesthetic, not unlike the freak show aesthetic we've talked about in some of the documentaries that we watched this semester, where the idea was, oh my God, these primitive people, how would they do things in such primitive ways, etc., etc. So it is this kind of colonial gaze that sets up a hierarchy, putting white culture, white Christian culture at the top, and regulating, say, for example, that Wolof woman making the urn to a kind of, much considerably lower class social status. This impulse to show how, quote unquote, the other half lives, or how, people in distress or in some sort of primitive state live, is a strong strain in European and world art film. For example, many of you have taken film history with me where we talked about neorealism, which was a film movement born in Italy after World War II, and whose appeal for American viewers in particular was a kind of poverty porn. That is, this was the end of World War II, and Americans wanted to see how badly Italy had been defeated in the war and how bad conditions were in Europe. And Italian filmmakers made stories of social oppressions and lower class poverty, partially to expose social ills, but also partially to show the effects of the war that wasn't possible to be seen from either the newsreels or the fiction films being made in Hollywood at the time. Certainly, these Italian filmmakers were interested in social reform, but I think one of the appeals for America was just the sort of sheer authenticity of the on-location shooting, the non-actors, and the kind of devastation that these films were chronicling almost by accident because they couldn't afford to shoot in studios. So neorealism is a good example of a kind of ethnographic gaze not trained on Africans, for example, or American Indians, but rather trained on the Italians who lost in the war in a very specific social circumstance. Another form of art cinema that deals with the issue of poverty and exoticizing the other was the rise of Cinema Novo, a movement in Brazilian cinema in the 1960s, where Brazilian filmmakers would chronicle what they called the aesthetic of hunger. And this aesthetic of hunger had two levels. One was that literally Brazil was starving during the period. It was a poor country. It was a country that had been woefully exploited by the U.S. and other countries, and they wanted to show their people starving. The film that's usually seen to start off this Cinema Novo, new cinema movement, was Nelson Pereira dos Santos's Barren Lives, made in 1963, which is all about a family migrating from their ancestral homeland to the city in order to survive. At one point, they literally start to eat their pets, including a parrot, because they are literally starving. So when we talk about an aesthetic of hunger, we are talking about literal starvation being one of the major subjects of the Cinema Novo films. In addition to that, there's a kind of hunger for a culture that isn't colonized by the first world. Certainly, it's absolutely true that Hollywood is one of the great sort of cultural colonialist powers that exists on the planet, distributing their films all around the world and setting the standards for those films, which is Hollywood blockbusters or bust, particularly these days where if it's not a big special effects spectacle, it's hard for indigenous cinema to thrive. And so these filmmakers, these radical filmmakers of the 60s and 70s, including Glauber Rocha, who took Hollywood genres like the Western and created a hero like Antonio das Mortes, a gunslinger who fought against colonialists. It was a hunger not only for literal food, but for cultural food, for an indigenous filmmaking that came out of the people's culture rather than being imposed by the economic machinations of a world cinema market that greatly favored Hollywood. The reason why I bring up these intersections between or among the process genre, among neorealism, among the ethnographic gaze, is that this week we're watching a number of documentaries that show different cultures and the process of indigenous harvests and crafts that exist in those cultures. Red Persimmons, for example, or Mimbre, one of the South American films that we're watching this semester that deals specifically with ancient ways of sort of assembling wicker furniture and wicker art. And I want to ask the question when we get into class this week, are these films loving portraits of indigenous crafts? Are these films kind of poverty porn that sort of emphasizes how the other half lives when they don't have the materials that the first world has in order to assemble crafts that are more durable or more quickly assembled and more economically viable? Is it both? Is it neither? These are the kinds of questions I want to ask and the kinds of questions that Sharitsky asks in her process genre book. And that's part of what we'll be talking about in class this week.